Hello dear chess friends, I'm International Master Andrey Ostovskiy and you're welcome to the 7th lesson of the series dedicated to defense and counterattack in chess. You have probably heard the idea that the best defense is the attack, and in some cases it's true. This first position is taken from the game Ballon and Sabo. We can see that white has more space, white controlled the center. We can see this protected passed pawn on d5. It is a great power in the future. But what is more importantly is the position of the pawn on f5. So this secures white's advantage on the king side, and white's typical plan in such a situation is just to play g4, g5. This attack might be very quick, and black has no chance to prevent it because any move with the pawn on the king side will be a self-weakening of the position. We discussed this situation in previous lessons. So it is better for black to counterattack here. And the question is what to do. So we can see that black is definitely better on the queen side. So this side should be the place where black has to counterattack. But how to do that? So there are usually several ideas when you have a pawn majority. So it's possible, for example, to play something like a5, b4, trying to create a passed pawn with the help of c3. But it looks a bit slow, because white just starts attacking g4, g5, the knight will be kicked away from f6, probably forced to e8 position, so white will continue with opening up files on the king side. Everyone says that just pushing pawns is not the greatest idea for black, so what to do instead? Typically, when you want to arrange a counterattack, it is a good idea to consider activating your pieces mainly. That's why black decided to make the move rook f8 to c8. So, first of all, black prepares c3, after which the rook will be definitely very active. And this will also break white's position on the queen side, so it will lead to weakening of some squares, some pawns, especially a3 will be a target for black's pieces. Very nice. Another idea is that after rook f8 to c8, whenever knight goes to e8, it will never blockade the rook on f8, so this rook will remain active. Also, we can see that the king achieves square f8, so just in case, black will need to evacuate the king from the king side. Now it is possible, so king is also not limited. So rook f8 to c8 is a very good multi-purpose move, preparing the counterattack. White played g4, black played c3, so that was prepared. Now we can see if white takes on c3, then rook takes on c3, and the rook is already very active. There are a lot of different threats, including just capturing the pawn on a3. Also, it is possible to exploit the pin along the third rank. In some cases, bishop c5 is ready to join the active play. Another rook is ready to be activated, so black definitely has sufficient counterplay. So after c3, white decided to play b3, keeping position on the queen side closed, more or less, and preventing activation of black's pieces. But black continued his plan, he just played c2. So this move has the idea of freeing the c3 square for the rook. In some cases, of course, it might be possible to play c1, but we can see that it is not the main purpose. Main purpose is just to activate the pieces. c3 is free to occupy with the rook, which is very nice. g5, knight goes to e8. So at the moment, we can see that white has no clear way to open up files on the king side, which gives black additional time. Bishop goes to d2, just to prevent rook c3, very good idea. But queen goes to e7, attacking a new target which arose after white weakened this pawn with the help of b3 move. So pawn is hanging, g5 is also under pressure, so in some cases it will be possible to exploit the situation of the overloadness of the bishop d2, because it controls g5 and at the same time it controls some squares on the queen side. So let's have a look. White plays b4, simply protecting a3, and at first glance it looks like black's play on the queen side is stuck. But as we discussed, g5 is vulnerable and black has a chance to come up with the nice tactics. So a5, just breaking through on the queen side anyway. B takes a5 and rook takes a5. So the point is that if bishop takes on a5, it is possible to play c1. Rook takes, and in the game it was rook takes c1, queen takes g5 check. That is exactly the idea behind the deflection of the bishop. And after queen g3 and queen c1, we can see that white has no attack anymore. It's now possible to break through on the king side. Pawn a3 is weak, black's pieces are more active. e4 is a potential target as well, because it is a backward pawn and it can't be protected by pawns from adjacent files. So black has great blockading square on d6, which can be occupied by the knight very soon when the bishop is activated and goes somewhere on c5, or takes the bishop on b4 when white plays bishop b4, and so on. So black's position is very good, and black managed to win the game. Instead of taking on c1 a second time, it was probably better for white to play h4, protecting g5 pawn. So we can see that rook e1 is protected. And after, let's say, queen a7 check, king g2, rook c4, because the rook is hanging, it's time to make something with this rook. Rook goes to c4, bishop on a5 is under attack, a3 pawn is also vulnerable, so bishop b4 is more or less forced. So here, after bishop takes, pawn takes, and rook takes, of course, black's position is already a bit more pleasant, because black has simply more active pieces, and the knight is going to d6 to counterattack e4 pawn, and so on. But according to analysis, this position should be more or less equal. So in this case, white had the best chances to make a draw. So it was the first example of the counterattack, and from this example we can squeeze some portion of important information. So first of all, there are some situations in which passive defense or defense on the side where you are attacked is simply not possible, so it will be definitely not efficient. So this is a sign that you have to search for a counterplay. The second point is to understand the side where you have best chances to come up with a counterplay. Typically it is the opposite side of the board. In this case it was the queen side where black had pawn majority, and this means black is better there. And the third point is to come up with active pieces play. So in many cases, just pushing pawns on the other side of the board appears quite slow. So it's better to do everything to activate your pieces. Let's have a look on the other example. This position arose in a classic game between Geller and Ava. So we can see that white's attack on the king side is coming. The rook is about to occupy h-file, the queen can join easily this rook from h5, and h7 will be a target, and of course the king is in trouble, because something like h6 is simply not efficient. We can see this bishop c1 is ready to sacrifice himself on h6, so position might be completely exposed in a few moves on the king side. So having this situation when black simply has no enough space to maneuver his pieces on the king side means easily that black has no chance to come up with a normal defense. So all the pieces are placed not that great. So this is a sign of a counterattack. Black has to find a way to come up with a counterplay on the other side of the board. But how? Because queen side doesn't look like weakened. It's not very simple to find a spot on the queen side to attack. So in this situation, black has to stick to the idea of activating the pieces, just like we discussed in the previous example. And at the same time, it is a good method to identify the most vulnerable spot, the most vulnerable point in opponent's position. So in such a situation, it might be d4 pawn, because only this pawn is not that protected, first of all, and probably it is the only piece in white's position that can be accessible for black's pieces in a few moves. So black played b5, a very good move, supporting the great knight c4 additionally, and at the same time preparing a very good and active move queen to b6, simply attacking d4. So in such a case, black will have some chances to come up with a counterplay at least. Rook goes to h4, white prepares his attack, everything is just natural. Queen goes to b6, And it appears that white can't ignore this threat because queen d4 will be very, very efficient. So rook on a1 is hanging. It's not that easy to protect this pawn. So white came up with another nice resource, e5, which helps the rook to join the defense of the d4 pawn. And at the same time, this opens up bishop d3. So in many cases, this bishop may become a decisive piece in the sense of attack on the king side. Black took on e5 with the knight, using the pin of the d4 pawn, and at the same time challenging the bishop d3. White, of course, took on e6. Now h7 is hanging, and it is a very dangerous threat, so black has to react with the knight takes d3. Otherwise, black is simply lost. And now the first interesting moment. So it looks like white can, instead of queen takes d3, which happened in the game, to take on d7, intermediate capture, attacking the rook and the knight. In fact, here black has a sufficient resource. It is rook takes c1, pinning the queen, and in this case, black is already 2 minor pieces up, and as a result, black ends up with the material advantage, at least. So e d7 doesn't work, but queen d3 looks also great because h7 is now under attack. It's not possible to ignore this threat. At the same time, d7 is hanging, so black definitely has to take the e6 pawn. Otherwise, it will be just a queen h7 checkmate. So black has to eliminate this pawn. Queen takes h7, king goes to f7, and after bishop h6, black's position looks very dangerous. So white controls a lot of squares. White exerts enormous pressure on black's position. The rook a1 is about to join this attack from, let's say, f1 file. The knight is about to jump to f5, creating new threats, and so on. So it doesn't look like black achieved something with his active play. Started with b5 and queen b6. In fact, it is not true, because as we can see, position became more or less open. And at the moment, bishop b7 exerts serious pressure on g2. So it wasn't possible without this b5, queen b6 active play, because in that case, white would probably have not opened up a position with the help of e5 and so on. So this bishop is very good. Again, g2 looks like the only accessible spot, the only accessible point for black's pieces. The only problem with that c2 square at the moment is controlled, so black cannot play rook c2 immediately. And this gives black an idea of a nice combination. So rook goes to h8, one of a sudden. It was probably a shocking move, so it's not clear, but probably Geller just missed this resource, because after that he lost the game almost immediately, despite having good chances to survive it. So queen takes h8 and rook jumps to c2. And now we can see a great difference. So of course white exerts pressure on black's king, no questions, but looks like white's pieces are all misplaced because there are no concrete threats. At the same time, black has a very concrete threat just to take on g2, and it might be just fatal for white. So the best defense for white was to play d5, and after, let's say, bishop takes d5, rook goes to d1, targeting the bishop, and after rook takes g2, let's say, king goes to f1. So now black has no immediate follow-up to his attack, and this means white has the time. So after g takes h6 and queen takes h6, position should be more or less equal. So it is really messy. Black has a lot of chances to attack the king, and white has an extra exchange, but well, dynamics are very important here, so that black has a full compensation for sacrificed material. And psychologically, of course, black is already better because situation just changed dramatically, and instead of attack, white has to think of defense. But still, it was the best way for white to play. In a game, white played rook to c1 immediately, and after rook takes g2 and king f1, we can see the difference. So bishop is not on d5 but on b7, which gives black's queen great opportunities. And after queen b3, white simply has no normal defense because there are a lot of different threats, including queen f3. So king went to e1, but queen anyway went to f3 with the threat of, let's say, queen f2 followed by rook g1 with the checkmate, and white has no defense. So one of a sudden, Black managed to win the game, and it was the result of the active counterplay. So when you stay and wait, opponent feels very, very comfortable. But when you come up with the active counterplay, it appears usually very annoying for your opponent because he has to deflect his attention to preventive measures, maybe to protection, and so on. And in some cases, when you come up with the very active counterplay, just like here after rook h8, it might destroy your opponent completely. So from a psychological point of view, it was a shocking move, and it appeared very, very efficient because it was absolutely correct from a chess point of view. So it led to a unclear position in the best line for white. But as you can see, being focused on the attack, Geller just failed to change his mind and to focus on the defense, and this became fatal. So Over just counterattacked and won the game. Thanks for your attention. See you next lessons.